My name is Laura, and if I am telling you my story now, it is because I have carried it in silence for too long. When I was 15, my parents left me on a bench in Riverside Park, New York, and they never came back. I can still remember the way the light looked that evening, how the sun was sinking low and washing the Hudson River in gold. They told me they were going to buy hot dogs from a vendor nearby. I didn't question it, because that's what parents do, step away for a moment and come back. I watched the pigeons bob their heads around my shoes, waiting for crumbs. I counted minutes, then hours, until the lamps flickered on one by one. The air turned cool, the chatter in the park thinned, and still, they didn't return. At first, I thought maybe they had gotten lost in the crowd or delayed in line. Then I told myself there had to be some kind of emergency. But by the time the dark had settled, and I was the last child left on that bench, something inside me began to twist. I walked the path home, still hoping they would be there waiting. Our house was a small brick one in Washington Heights, squeezed between taller buildings that made it look like a child caught between adults. The porch light was off. The curtains were closed. I knocked, I pounded, I shouted their names. Nothing. I tried the key in my pocket, but it wouldn't turn. At first, I thought maybe I was shaking too much. Then Mr. Daniels, the landlord, stepped out from the shadow of the stoop. He was holding a cigarette and looking at me with tired eyes. "They're gone, Laura," he said flatly, as if he were telling me the weather forecast. "Rents are late. Locks are changed." My heart sank into the pit of my stomach. I begged him to let me in, just for one night, but he shook his head. He said rules were rules. I had only $18 in my pocket, and suddenly the city felt larger and more dangerous than it ever had before. That night, I sat on the curb across from the house, hugging my knees until my legs went numb. I stared at the front door, willing it to open, but it never did. The house that once smelled of my mother's cooking and my father's cologne had turned into nothing but bricks and glass. It was no longer mine. The next morning, a kind neighbor named Grace noticed me outside. She had always been warm, always slipping me cookies when I came to visit with my parents. When she saw me with my swollen eyes and my small pile of belongings, she didn't ask too many questions. She simply said, "Come inside." For 1 week, she let me sleep on her sofa. Her apartment smelled faintly of lavender, and she always kept the kettle warm. Those 7 days were my soft landing before the hard years came. Eventually, I knew I couldn't stay with Grace forever. She was generous, but she had her own family to feed. So, I found a room above a small deli for $200 a month. The space was hardly bigger than a closet, with a single window that looked out over a fire escape and the brick wall across from it. Still, it was mine. I bought a thin mattress and a blanket from a thrift store and told myself that I had a home again. I started working at the diner on 181st Street, the kind of place where the neon sign buzzed all night and the smell of fried bacon seemed to cling to the walls. They didn't care that I was only 15. They paid me in cash, and that was enough. My job was simple: carry plates, refill coffee, smile at strangers. The pay wasn't much, but the tips kept me alive. $3 from one table, $5 from another. A crumpled $10 bill on a good day felt like treasure. Over time, I learned to count money by feel. The weight of coins, the crispness of bills, all became second nature. I learned the rhythms of the night shift. Nurses came in with tired eyes, their scrubs smelling faintly of disinfectant. Cab drivers called me kiddo and told me stories about the wild rides they'd had through the streets of Manhattan. A musician named Emily sometimes played her guitar in the corner for a cup of coffee, her voice soft but steady. These people became my accidental family, the cast of characters who reminded me that not everyone had left. But no matter how many plates I carried or how many smiles I gave, there was always a shadow in my chest. I told myself this was my life now. Keep the plates moving, keep the smile. Don't think about what was lost. Don't think about the house that used to be mine. Don't think about the parents who had left me in the park without a word, without a backward glance. Sometimes, late at night, when I walked back to my little room, I would pass by our old house in Washington Heights. I would stand across the street and stare at it. Lights would be glowing inside, laughter spilling through the windows. but it wasn't my family anymore. Another family lived there, filling the rooms with new memories, erasing the old ones. The curtains were different, the paint fresher. To them, it was simply a home. To me, it was a graveyard of what could have been. I learned quickly to harden my heart. To survive in New York without parents, without guidance, meant growing a shell. I kept my head down, worked my shifts, and taught myself to be invisible. Yet every time I touched that old key still in my pocket, the one that no longer opened any door, I felt a sting. It was proof that once, for a little while, I had belonged somewhere. The city tested me in 1,000 small ways. I learned to stretch $1 until it screamed. Rent, food, subway fare, every decision mattered. I skipped meals, walked miles when I couldn't afford the Metro card, and wore shoes until the soles peeled away. But I also learned resilience. I discovered that I could make it through nights of hunger and mornings of exhaustion. I discovered that survival was its own kind of education, one that the schools could never teach. Still, I kept asking myself the same quiet question. Why? Why had they left me? Why had my parents decided that a hot dog stand was the last excuse they would ever need? The question gnawed at me like hunger, and though I buried it deep, it never truly disappeared. It stayed inside me, waiting for the day when the truth, or something close to it, would come crashing back into my life. 15 years passed like a slow storm, shaping me in ways I didn't notice until I looked back. By the time I turned 30, my hands bore the small burns of a waitress's life, tiny marks from the grill, scratches from balancing plates, lines that should have belonged to someone older. I could carry 4 dishes at once without spilling, I could smile even when my feet screamed, and I could stretch $1 until it tore. I thought that was all I would ever be, a woman who served food, collected crumpled tips, and went home to a tiny room above a deli. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything shifted. The diner was nearly empty, the hum of the refrigerator louder than the soft jazz coming from the radio. I was cleaning glasses behind the counter, watching the TV mounted on the wall more out of boredom than interest. It was tuned to a business news channel, the kind I usually ignored. But that day, the anchor's voice caught my attention. He was talking about a company, Hale Dynamics, that was celebrating its success in America and expanding into Europe. Then the camera cut to the owner. The glass in my hand slipped and shattered against the counter. The face staring out from the screen was not a stranger's. It was my father's. Victor Hale. The name rolled out of the anchor's mouth with weight, as if it were a crown. Beside him stood my mother, Margaret, her silver dress glittering under the lights of a stage. They were in Chicago, smiling as if they had built their empire with clean hands, as if they were proud of each other and proud of what they had done. The reporter praised them for their vision, their wealth, and their ability to inspire. The words washed over me in a blur. I didn't hear the rest of the report because something inside me had gone hollow, like the wind rushing through a tunnel. All I could do was stare. I saw his jaw, the exact same angle I saw every morning in my own mirror. I saw his eyes, sharp and pale, and I recognized them too well. My mother's smile was the same one she had given me when I was little, a smile I had spent years chasing in my dreams. My legs felt weak, and I looked down at my shoes. They were worn, bought on sale for $29.99 at a discount store. The laces frayed, the soles thinning. And I thought of the contrast. My shoes, my life, my paycheck of less than $24,000 a year against their millions, no, billions, counted with easy hands. Something rose in me then, not tears, but something colder, harder, heavier. Anger had always been a shadow in my chest, but now it was awake. That evening, I walked through Washington Heights until I stood in front of the house that used to be mine. A new family lived there now. The curtains were different, bright and cheerful. A child's bicycle leaned against the steps, its training wheels tilted at an angle. I stood on the sidewalk and counted my breaths, steady, slow, as if I could hold myself together by sheer will. Each breath was a reminder of the years I had spent pouring coffee, folding napkins, scraping by while Victor Hale built towers of money. I thought of the bench in Riverside Park, the one where they left me when I was 15. The wood had been cold against my legs, and I had stared at the path, waiting for them to return. 15 years later, I was still waiting in some way, still carrying the question of why. But now I had my answer, even if it was bitter. They hadn't disappeared. They hadn't died. They had chosen. They had walked away from me to build something else. And they had succeeded. For a moment, I imagined knocking on the door of the house, asking the new family if I could step inside, if I could stand in the kitchen and smell the air one more time. But I didn't. That was no longer my house, no longer my life. Instead, I turned and walked back into the night, my steps heavy but certain. As I moved through the streets, neon lights flickering above me and sirens echoing in the distance, I realized something had shifted inside me forever. I could no longer accept my silence. For 15 years, I had swallowed my story, telling myself survival was enough. But survival was not enough anymore. The sight of Victor's face on that screen, Margaret's smile beside him, had cracked something open. I knew then that I would not stay quiet. I would tell the world everything. I would tell them about the park, about the locked door, about the $18 in my pocket. I would tell them about Grace's sofa and the deli room and the endless hours of work that gave me just enough to scrape by. I would tell them about the burns on my hands and the ache in my bones, about the shoes I wore thin while they polished their wealth. I would tell them the truth that Victor and Margaret Hale had hidden so well. Because if there was one thing I had learned in all my years in New York, it was this. Sometimes survival is not about keeping your head down. Sometimes survival is about raising your voice, even when it shakes, even when it burns. That night, I lay awake in my small room above the deli, staring at the cracked ceiling. For the first time in years, I felt a purpose larger than myself. The anger inside me was not just pain anymore, it was fuel. I decided I would not wait for justice to find me. I would make it myself. The girl on the park bench had been silent. The waitress carrying plates had endured. But the woman I was now had seen the truth on a television screen, and she would no longer look away. The night after I saw Victor and Margaret on television, I couldn't sleep. My small room above the deli felt tighter than ever, as though the walls had shifted inward. I lay on my mattress staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the distant horns from Broadway, my mind replaying their faces again and again. I had carried my silence for 15 years, but now silence felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the girl on the park bench. Betrayal of the woman I had fought to become. I made a decision that night. If I had no family, then my story would be my family. If I had no house, then my truth would be my shelter. I would no longer hide behind shame or fear. I would speak. The next day, I went to a pawn shop on 182nd Street. With $150 saved in an envelope tucked under my mattress, I bought a secondhand phone for $120 and a small ring light for $30. The man behind the counter smirked at me when I asked if the phone's camera worked well. "Good enough for TikTok, sweetheart," he said. I nodded, clutching the plastic bag as if it contained the key to something bigger. Back in my room, I set up the light on a wobbly chair and balanced the phone against a stack of books. I sat cross-legged on the mattress, staring into the camera lens, and for a moment, my voice caught in my throat. I wasn't sure anyone would care. I wasn't sure I had the right to take up space in a world that had already discarded me once. But then I remembered the park bench, the locked house, the burns on my hands from years of work. My silence had already cost me enough. I pressed record. At first, my voice shook, but I kept going. I said my name. I said the exact date I was left in Riverside Park, October 17th, 15 years ago. I held up the old brass key that once opened the house on 179th Street, the key that had sat in my pocket all these years, useless and heavy. I showed my pay stubs, each line proving how little I earned, just under $24,000 a year. I explained how I learned to sleep with a chair wedged under the door for safety, how I stretched $600 for rent, $80 for a Metro card, $50 for shoes, and a few leftover dollars for dreams. And then I told the truth. I said the man on TV, Victor Hale, the billionaire, was my father. I said the woman beside him, Margaret, was my mother. I said they had never called, never written, not once in 15 years. My voice hardened as I spoke, steady and sharp, like a blade finally finding its edge. When I finished, I let the silence hang. Then I pressed post. I didn't expect what came next. At first, there were just a few comments, strangers typing, "Stay strong," and "You're brave." But then the numbers climbed. Dozens of views became hundreds, hundreds became thousands. By morning, my story had spread across New York, then Boston, then Los Angeles. People shared the video with captions like, "This is what billionaires hide," and "Listen to her." My phone buzzed nonstop with notifications until I turned the sound off. Journalists started reaching out, asking for interviews. Lawyers emailed, offering to represent me for free. A reporter begged to meet me at Riverside Park, to film me on the very bench where it all began. I agreed, and at sunrise we stood there together. The camera pointed at me, the river glimmering in the background, as I touched the wood of the bench that had once been my whole world. My voice didn't shake this time. Donations began to pour in from strangers who set up online fundraisers on my behalf. $10 here, 20 there. One message came from a woman in London who sent £50 with a note, for the girl who kept going. I cried when I read that. Not because of the money, but because someone across an ocean saw me, believed me. With the first wave of donations, I paid off my credit card debt, $2, for 80 gone in one click. I kept nothing else. I wanted the truth to stand alone, unbought and unburdened. Then the city began to turn. Hale Dynamics, once praised as untouchable, started to crumble. Partners cut ties overnight, issuing cold public statements that they no longer aligned with the company's values. Shareholders resigned live on television, their polished smiles gone. The stock price tumbled by the day, the red numbers on the business channel now a mirror of my own rising story. Stores put up signs that read, "We don't carry Hale." Friends texted me pictures of empty shelves where Hale products once stood. One evening, as I left the diner, a man in a gray suit stopped me. He leaned in and whispered, "You've started a boycott." His eyes flickered with something between fear and respect. I walked past him without answering, but inside I felt a strange fire. This wasn't just about me anymore. My voice had become something larger, something that echoed in boardrooms and stock markets, something that cracked the glass towers of power. It hadn't been a plan. I hadn't set out to destroy anything. All I did was tell the truth of a girl abandoned in a park, a girl who worked tables while her parents climbed the ladder of wealth. But the truth, once spoken, has its own life. It moves where it wants. It finds ears that need to hear it. For the first time in 15 years, I felt air in my lungs that wasn't heavy. The silence I had carried all those years had been a prison, and with one video, I had broken out. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how far the fall of Hale Dynamics would go, or how Victor and Margaret would react. But I knew this. I was no longer invisible. My story had weight, my voice had reach, and I would never again be just a shadow in the corner of a diner. The city had listened, and the world was starting to listen too. It was a week after my video when the black car appeared outside the diner. I saw it through the front window as I refilled a customer's coffee. The car was sleek and polished, its presence out of place against the chipped sidewalks and buzzing neon of 181st Street. When the doors opened, my breath caught. Victor stepped out first, wearing a dark coat that fit him like armor. Margaret followed, clutching her purse tightly, as if it were the last lifeline she had. They walked into the diner like ghosts returning to the land of the living. Heads turned. Even in Washington Heights, where celebrity sightings were rare, people recognized them from the news. Victor's face had been on magazine covers, Margaret's name whispered at charity galas. And now they were here, walking toward me, their daughter, the one they had abandoned. "Laura," Margaret said softly, her voice almost a plea. "Can we talk?" I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. 15 years of silence, broken not by a letter, not by a phone call, but by them stepping into the place where I'd spent half my life serving eggs and pancakes. But instead, I nodded and led them to a booth near the back, one I had wiped down thousands of times. I slid into the seat across from them, the Formica table between us holding the weight of our history. They began quickly, as though rehearsed. They said they were sorry. They said life had been difficult back then, that stress had driven them to choices they didn't fully understand. They spoke in polished words, the kind that sounded like they belonged in press releases, not at a diner booth. Victor leaned forward, his voice firm but softened with practiced regret. "We want to make it right now. We can help you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table, but I didn't move. Her hand hovered in the air before she withdrew it. "We never stopped thinking about you," she whispered, but I heard the lie tucked inside her words. Then came the offers. First $5 million, then $10 million, then more, as though each number might be the magic key that would unlock forgiveness. The words dropped between us like heavy coins, one after another, until the air itself felt suffocated by the weight of money. I listened. I thought about the house that had locked me out. I thought about Grace, who had given me her sofa for 7 nights without asking for anything in return. I thought about Emily with her guitar, about the nurses with their tired eyes, about the cab drivers who called me kiddo. I thought about the chair I had wedged under my door every night in my tiny room above the deli, about the burn scars on my hands, about every small brave thing I had done just to survive. What did their money mean against that? What did $10 million mean against 15 years of silence? "I don't want your money," I said finally. My voice was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of all my years. "I don't want to be bought. I want you to feel the weight of what you chose." Victor blinked, as though unaccustomed to hearing the word no. Margaret's lips trembled. "I forgive myself," I continued, "and that is enough. But I will not forgive you. Not for what you did. Not for the years I lost. I will not be your secret. And I will not take your dollars to cover your shame." Silence fell over the booth. For the first time, they had no words. Victor leaned back, his face hardening, while Margaret looked down at her hands. I stood, leaving them behind in that booth, and walked past the counter toward the door. When I pushed it open, the bright day outside felt like freedom. The donations people had sent me were enough for a beginning. With the last of the money, I put down $68,000 as a down payment on a small blue house in Queens. It wasn't grand, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The porch was wide enough for 2 chairs, and the windows let in generous light. For the first time since I was 15, I had a front door that opened to me. On the wall inside, I hammered a nail and hung the old brass key, the one that once fit the lock of my childhood home but had long ago stopped opening anything. I didn't keep it as a reminder of loss, but as proof of survival. That key, useless as it was, had carried me through every shift, every lonely night. Now it hung where I could see it, a symbol not of what I had lost, but of what I had built. Sometimes I sit on the porch with a cup of cheap coffee, watching the street. Neighbors walk by, waving hello. Children ride their bikes down the sidewalk, their laughter echoing against the houses. The blue paint on the siding gleams in the sunlight, and I breathe in the simple truth: this house is mine, paid for $1 honest dollar at a time. People still write to me. They tell me their own stories of abandonment, of silence, of building themselves up from nothing. They ask me how to live after being left, how to keep moving forward when the people who should have loved them the most turned away. I tell them this: count what is yours. Count your breath, your work, your name. Don't measure your worth in what others withheld. If you must speak, speak plain. And if you must burn a bridge, make sure the fire lights your way forward. My story is no longer about revenge. It is about resilience. It is about a woman who was left in a park at 15 and built a life anyway. It is about a city that listened when I spoke, and about strangers who believed me enough to help me build a home. It is about America, where a waitress can look up at a TV, see a billionaire's face, and choose not to bow. And most of all, it is about doors. The ones that closed. The ones that never opened. And the one I own now, painted blue, opening only to the people I choose.